The room fell quiet the moment his words cut through the air. "I don't shake hands with staff." Not a smirk, not even a glance of hesitation. Just pure dismissal, aimed straight at the woman who had just extended her hand with the same dignity she brought into every room she entered. The handshake hung in the air for a second too long, her hand suspended, his eyes already elsewhere, like she wasn't worth the effort. In a space filled with suits and polished shoes, it was as though the air itself thickened, pressing down on everyone who witnessed it. Some shifted awkwardly in their seats. Others looked away, pretending they hadn't seen the insult land. But everyone felt it. A line had just been drawn. What the man didn't realize, standing there with his arrogance dressed as power, was that the line he drew would soon become the very fault line that would split his empire open. Her hand lowered slowly, not with defeat, but with a kind of composure that unsettles people who mistake quiet for weakness. No retort, no raised voice, just silence. The sort of silence that lingers and unsettles more than words ever could. To the men around the table, it might have seemed like the end of an exchange. A small moment of humiliation she'd have to swallow if she wanted to keep her seat at the table. That's what most people do. Let it slide, take the insult, and carry on. But not this time. Because what they didn't know was that this handshake wasn't just a handshake. It was the opening note to a storm that would rip through balance sheets, topple reputations, and leave one of the most powerful men in business scrambling to explain how his arrogance had cost him billions. And yet, in that exact second, he believed he'd won. He thought the deal was his, that her silence meant submission, that his empire would grow even larger while she sat quietly, grateful for crumbs. He was wrong, terribly wrong. Because when dignity is dismissed in the name of ego, the cost is never small. The real question wasn't whether there would be consequences. The real question was just how high the price would climb when she finally decided to collect. And soon, everyone in that building and across the world would see exactly what that price was. Before we continue, if you're new here, make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss stories like this one. And drop in the comments the country you're watching from. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Now let's get back to it. The man leaned back in his chair, shoulders heavy with pride, acting as though nothing significant had happened. A missed handshake, a casual insult. To him, it was nothing more than a moment. But to her, it was the spark. The spark that would set fire to the very contract he thought he had in his pocket. Because while he was busy pretending she was staff, she was quietly holding the power to end him, and to end the $7.6 billion future he believed was already secured. And the way she chose to respond changed everything. Naomi Carter's story never began in boardrooms or with billion-dollar contracts. It began in a modest two-bedroom house on the south side of Atlanta, where every corner of the home carried the weight of sacrifice. Her mother worked double shifts as a nurse. Her father juggled carpentry jobs that barely paid enough to keep the lights on. For Naomi, the lessons of her childhood weren't wrapped in comfort. They were forged in struggle. She learned early that the world would not hand her anything. She would have to reach for it, sometimes fight for it, and often do both with hands blistered from the climb. At 16, while her classmates were consumed with prom dresses and football games, Naomi was clocking out from a part-time job at a local diner. She still carried the smell of grease on her uniform when she sat down at her desk to study until dawn. Her teachers noticed something about her, a mind that refused to settle, a determination that carried a sharp edge. She wasn't just smart, she was relentless. That relentlessness carried her to Harvard, where she majored in economics. It wasn't an easy road. Classmates doubted her. Professors questioned whether she truly belonged. She was the only black woman in several of her finance courses, and she felt the sting of stares when she walked into rooms. The subtle whispers of quota followed her like shadows. But every whisper only pushed her further. Each doubting glance, another brick laid beneath her feet as she built her own staircase. After graduation, Naomi carved a path through Wall Street. She entered a space where few women, and even fewer black women, were ever welcomed. The culture of exclusion was heavy, but Naomi thrived in spite of it. She worked twice as long, made fewer mistakes, and delivered results others thought impossible. Within a decade, she had her own investment firm, one specializing in technology startups. She had a sharp eye for ideas others dismissed too quickly, especially when those ideas came from overlooked founders who reminded her of herself. Naomi's firm grew, and with it, her reputation. She was no longer the girl questioned in classrooms or the woman underestimated in boardrooms. She became the woman who could make or break a startup with a single phone call, the executive whose endorsement carried weight on Wall Street and beyond. Her net worth climbed into the billions. Yet, no matter how many headlines named her one of the most powerful women in business, she noticed the same pattern. In rooms full of men, her authority was still second-guessed. Even with billions in assets under management, people tried to box her in. They smiled, praised her success, but beneath the surface, they doubted. And Naomi had grown used to turning that doubt into fire. The trip to New York was supposed to be her crowning moment. A partnership that would cement her place not only in finance but in global commerce. A $7.6 billion deal was on the table. A collaboration with one of the largest corporate empires in aviation and tech. It wasn't just about money, it was about legacy. About showing that a black woman could sit at the head of the table, not as a token, not as a guest, but as the power broker who set the terms. She arrived in Manhattan days before the meeting, her schedule packed with briefings and late-night calls. Every detail mattered: the contracts, the projections, the strategy. Her team knew what was at stake, and so did Naomi. Yet beneath the layers of preparation, there was also something deeply personal. She wasn't just representing her firm, she was carrying with her every girl who had ever been overlooked, every woman who had been dismissed, and every person of color told to stay in the background. Naomi understood what the handshake in that boardroom was supposed to symbolize: equality, respect, the acknowledgement of partnership. She extended her hand not just as a CEO, but as someone who had climbed from the diner floors of Atlanta to the skyscrapers of Wall Street. And yet, in that critical moment, she was reduced, in his eyes, to staff. A single word, tossed out like trash, in a room where she should have been honored. But Naomi Carter was not built to shrink. She was built to rise. And in the hours ahead, her rise would come at a cost that no one in that room could have anticipated. The morning of the meeting arrived, and the skyscraper loomed like a monument to wealth and authority. Floor-to-ceiling glass windows reflected the city below, the hum of traffic drowned out by the silence of power and motion. Naomi stepped through the revolving doors, her team trailing behind her, each of them carrying binders, tablets, and the quiet determination that came from knowing they were on the edge of history. The boardroom was everything one would expect from a corporation of that size. Polished mahogany tables stretching far enough to look like a runway, leather chairs that swallowed those who sat in them, and artwork on the walls that signaled old money and legacy. But what stood out most was the people inside. It was a room dominated by white men in their 50s and 60s, their suits tailored, their watches glinting under the recessed lighting. Naomi's entrance was a disruption, even though she was supposed to be at the center of it all. Their eyes flicked toward her, then back to each other, as if silently agreeing she was an outsider trespassing on their circle. Still, she moved with the calm assurance of someone who had earned her place. Her heels clicked against the marble as she crossed the room, her presence deliberate, her shoulders squared. She had been in rooms like this before, too many times, where she was greeted with polite smiles masking disbelief that she could possibly hold real authority. The introductions began. Executives shook hands, exchanging names and thin compliments. Each time, Naomi offered hers with grace, her grip firm, her eyes steady. One by one they acknowledged her, though some did it with a stiffness that betrayed reluctance. Then the door opened, and the man they had all been waiting for entered. The billionaire CEO. He carried himself like gravity bent toward him, every step a declaration that this was his domain. Conversations quieted as he strode in, nodding at his peers. Naomi extended her hand as he approached, her gesture professional, unshaken, even warm. His eyes flicked down, lingered for a moment, then snapped back up, cold, dismissive. And then came the words, sharp enough to slice through the polished air. I don't shake hands with staff." A few men chuckled nervously, unsure whether to follow his lead or hide behind neutrality. Others glanced at their phones, pretending to be distracted. But the damage had already been done. The insult didn't just hang in the room, it branded itself onto the deal itself. Naomi's hand remained suspended for a moment before she lowered it. She said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence was heavy, measured, intentional. And though the man took his seat at the head of the table with smug satisfaction, Naomi was already calculating. The meeting began. Charts and projections projected on screens, analysts rattling off numbers with practiced ease. But beneath the corporate jargon, an undeniable tension stretched across the table. Naomi contributed when necessary, her voice precise and confident, but her mind was elsewhere. She studied him. The arrogance in the way he leaned back, the way he interrupted others mid-sentence, the way he spoke of markets and partnerships as though they were his by divine right. He believed his dominance was secure. He believed her silence meant compliance. What he failed to see was that silence can be the loudest response. Because Naomi knew something he did not. The deal on the table was not his to grant. It was hers to sign. Her signature was the final bridge to $7.6 billion. And without it, everything he had promised to his shareholders, to his board, to the press, would collapse like sand underwater. As the meeting dragged on, voices rose and fell, but Naomi's mind sharpened around one truth. She would not reward disrespect with partnership. He had mistaken her for staff. He had mistaken her dignity as negotiable. And in doing so, he had made the most expensive mistake of his career. The paper sat in the folder before her, ready for signatures. The ink would never touch them. Not now, not after this. And though no one else in the room knew it yet, a decision had already been made. The room didn't recover from the words as quickly as the man who had spoken them. He carried on like nothing had happened, sliding into the chair at the head of the table, loosening his cufflinks and signaling for the presentation to continue. But the sting remained, clinging to the air like smoke. Naomi's hand had dropped to her side, her expression unreadable. She wasn't the type to let anger flash across her face. Not here, not now. Years of being underestimated had taught her the discipline of control. But inside, the insult settled deep. Not because it was new, but because it was so familiar. The glances from others at the table told the story in silence. One man shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his tie. Another cleared his throat, but said nothing. The few women present looked down at their notepads, unwilling to meet Naomi's eyes. They had all seen what had happened, but no one spoke. That silence was its own betrayal, proof of how easily racism was excused when money was involved. Naomi leaned forward in her chair, listening as the discussion moved into forecasts and projections. But her focus wasn't on the numbers. It was on the weight of what had just occurred. A billionaire CEO had stood in front of peers, dismissed her humanity in front of witnesses, and reduced her to staff. That word wasn't just a misstep, it was a declaration of hierarchy. To him, she wasn't an equal. She wasn't a partner. She was someone to stand beside the table, not at it. Her eyes flicked across the table, studying faces. The way some men smirked as though entertained by the insult, the way others kept their distance as if her discomfort was contagious. She knew exactly what was happening. They were watching to see if she would absorb it. They wanted to know if she would take the humiliation quietly, swallow her pride for the sake of billions. That expectation was its own form of violence. Still, Naomi refused to give them the satisfaction of an outburst. She steadied her breathing, opened the folder in front of her, and began reviewing the documents line by line, as though the world hadn't just shifted. Her calm was disarming. Some mistook it for weakness, others for fear. But it was neither. It was a strategy. Because Naomi understood something that the man at the head of the table had overlooked. In negotiations, dignity is leverage, and once it's trampled on, the deal itself begins to rot. The CEO leaned back in his chair, speaking over others, tossing condescending asides in Naomi's direction whenever she raised a point. At one moment, he chuckled and said, "That's ambitious," when she suggested a growth projection. Another time, he muttered, "We'll keep the heavy lifting on our end." Each remark layered insult over insult, subtle enough to escape official record, but sharp enough to pierce. It wasn't just about a handshake anymore. It was about dominance. He wanted the room to see her belittled, to remind them and her who he believed held real power. And for a moment, the boardroom seemed to play along. Laughter at his jokes, nods at his interruptions, a silent chorus agreeing with his dismissal. Naomi was being pushed to the margins, erased in real time from the position she had earned, yet she didn't flinch. Her pen moved across the pages with steady strokes, marking notes, circling figures. But what she was really doing was something no one else in the room could see. She was making a decision, one that would not only end the meeting, but also rewrite the future they all thought was secured. Her silence wasn't submission, it was the sound of patience hardening into resolve. The humiliation was real, the racism was clear. And though no one dared to speak it aloud, everyone in that room felt the shift, the moment where dignity collided with arrogance, and consequences became inevitable. He thought she was cornered. He thought she would sign, smile, and let it slide. But Naomi Carter wasn't in the business of letting racism slide. And soon, the very men who had smirked in silence would realize they had just witnessed the beginning of an empire crumbling. The meeting droned on, slides flashing across the screen, voices trading numbers and predictions. To anyone watching casually, Naomi looked calm, a woman taking notes, eyes steady, posture straight. But beneath that stillness lived a fire so sharp it threatened to burn through the paper in front of her. She had endured moments like this before. She knew what it felt like to be treated as though she didn't belong, to have her expertise ignored until a man repeated her words and received applause. But this was different. This wasn't a quiet slight buried in polite conversation. This was public humiliation. A billionaire had stripped her dignity in front of a room full of witnesses and expected her to carry on as though nothing had happened. And that was where he had miscalculated. Naomi didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue or demand respect. Instead, she reached for the weapon she had always trusted most: restraint. There is a power in silence that unsettles arrogant men, and Naomi wielded it like a blade. Her pen moved deliberately across the documents before her, but she wasn't just reviewing numbers. She was making a decision. Every line she circled, every note she scribbled, was another step away from the deal they all thought was inevitable. Her phone, tucked at the edge of her folder, buzzed with a discreet notification. She glanced down for only a second before typing a single text to her legal counsel. Before we continue, let me pause for a moment. If stories like this move you, stories of dignity, injustice, and resilience, make sure you subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ. And let me know in the comments the country you're watching from. I'd love to see where our community is growing around the world. Pull the contracts, now. It was only 4 words, but those 4 words carried the weight of $7.6 billion. The attorney on the other end didn't need explanation. They knew her well enough to understand that when Naomi Carter sent an instruction like that, something irreversible had happened. Back at the table, the CEO laughed at his own joke, leaning back with the smugness of a man who believed he had already won. He had no idea the ground was already shifting beneath him. Naomi's silence in that moment was not weakness. It was fury, contained and sharpened into strategy. She knew the rules of this world better than most. If she stormed out, they would call her emotional. If she raised her voice, they would label her aggressive. If she showed even a flicker of anger, they would twist it into justification for the insult she had endured. So she gave them none of that. She gave them composure. Her mind returned to memories she had buried deep, of professors who suggested she was lucky to be admitted, of clients who mistook her for an assistant, of investors who looked past her to the man standing beside her, assuming he was the real decision-maker. The insults had changed in scale, but not in nature. Even now, with billions under her control, they still tried to reduce her. But if history had taught her anything, it was this: dignity was non-negotiable. The CEO didn't notice the shift. He was too busy parading his dominance, interrupting others, dismissing Naomi's insights with offhand comments that dripped condescension. He thought the silence meant compliance. He thought she was waiting for his approval. He was wrong. Because Naomi wasn't waiting, she was planning. Her attorneys were already working behind the scenes, the ink of the contracts turning cold with every passing second. Deals like this weren't signed on paper alone. They were built on trust, respect, partnership. And the moment he had refused her hand, he had shattered all three. Naomi looked up, meeting his gaze for the first time since the insult. She didn't glare. She didn't frown. She simply looked at him with a steadiness that unsettled even the most confident men. A look that said, "You think you know power. You have no idea." The rest of the boardroom remained oblivious to the decision already in motion. They spoke of profits, expansion, and new markets, not realizing that the future they envisioned had already been pulled from under them. And while the billionaire spoke as if he held the world in his hands, Naomi Carter sat in silence, a silence that would soon echo louder than any words she could have spoken. The presentation carried on, as if nothing had changed. Graphs shifted on the large screen, analysts spoke with rehearsed confidence, and executives nodded as though the numbers had already secured their fortune. The billionaire CEO leaned back in his chair, satisfied, convinced he had cemented his dominance over the room. But beneath the polished surface, currents were already moving. Naomi's text had gone through, and within minutes her legal team began halting the machinery of the deal. Drafts were recalled, contracts locked from digital access, sign-off approvals frozen. The $7.6 billion partnership that seemed unstoppable only moments earlier was suddenly suspended in silence, its future unraveling without a word spoken in that room. At first, the change was subtle. A junior executive at the far end of the table glanced at his phone, his brow furrowing as he read the incoming alert. He shifted uncomfortably, whispering to the man beside him. Another phone buzzed, then another. Within minutes, a quiet ripple of confusion began spreading across the polished table. The CEO didn't notice. Or perhaps he didn't care. He was too busy talking over Naomi, too busy dismissing her contributions, too wrapped up in his own arrogance to see the storm forming around him. Naomi noticed. Her eyes scanned the room, catching every small reaction. The way one executive straightened in his seat, the way another pressed his lips together in irritation. They were beginning to realize something was wrong. And though they hadn't connected the dots yet, Naomi already knew what the message on their screens said. Her attorneys had sent the first notice. Contract review paused pending directive from Miss Carter. That line alone was enough to send tremors through the group. Pending directive from Miss Carter. She was not staff. She was the one holding the pen, the one whose directive decided whether this deal lived or died. The whispers grew louder, the sidelong glances harder to ignore. The CEO finally paused, annoyed by the shifting energy in the room. "Gentlemen," he said with forced laughter, "let's focus. We have billions on the line here." He didn't realize that the billions he spoke of were already gone. Naomi kept her composure, her pen moving slowly over her notes as though she hadn't noticed the growing chaos. But her silence was deliberate. She wanted them to feel the weight of uncertainty, the cracks spreading in real time, while she remained untouchable. Another buzz. Another executive frowned. One finally raised his hand mid-discussion, his voice hesitant. "Excuse me, but I'm seeing that our legal access to the contract portal has been restricted. Is this temporary?" The CEO waved him off. "Tech glitch. Don't worry about it." But Naomi knew, and so did the few who were paying attention, that this was no glitch. This was power shifting hands. The arrogance at the head of the table began to falter. The CEO leaned forward, speaking more quickly now, trying to regain control of the room. But control was already slipping. The deal they thought was guaranteed was beginning to crumble, and not a single person dared to confront the woman who had set it in motion. Naomi's phone buzzed again. She glanced down briefly. All drafts withdrawn, awaiting further instruction. Her lips curved into the faintest trace of a smile. Not triumph, but recognition. Recognition that in a room where she had been dismissed, she had just pulled the ground out from under every man at that table. And still, no one spoke her name. They continued presenting slides, numbers echoing against walls that now felt thinner, weaker. But beneath their voices, the truth had already taken root. The deal was collapsing in real time, and the woman they had tried to humiliate was the one dismantling it. The CEO cleared his throat, irritation sharp in his tone. "Let's not get distracted," he said, voice tighter now. "We'll have this deal signed by the end of the day." But across the table, Naomi sat in silence, her decision already made. The ink he expected would never touch the page, and though he still believed he controlled the future of this partnership, the reality was far different. The fallout had already begun. When the meeting finally wrapped, the room was buzzing with quiet confusion. Executives left with forced smiles and hurried steps, each of them secretly wondering what the alerts on their phones had meant. The billionaire CEO brushed it all off, shaking hands with his peers, speaking about next steps as though his victory was sealed. Naomi left the boardroom without a word. Her team followed in silence, their expressions tight, as though they too sensed the gravity of what had just unfolded. They knew Naomi well enough to understand that she was not the type to let humiliation pass unanswered. By the time she reached her car, the plan was already in motion. She wasn't going to send a quiet email or a private withdrawal. She was going to make the world watch. That evening, under the bright lights of Midtown Manhattan, Naomi Carter called a press conference. The media had been eager to cover the deal for weeks. $7.6 billion had a way of attracting headlines. But what they received that night was not the story they expected. The cameras flashed as she stepped to the podium, dressed in a simple black suit, her posture tall, her presence commanding. The room fell into silence as she placed her notes down, adjusted the microphone, and began to speak. "Respect is not optional," she said, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. "And no amount of money will ever be enough to compromise dignity." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The reporters, caught off guard, began frantically scribbling notes. Naomi didn't pause. "Today, during negotiations, I was dismissed not as a partner, not as an equal, but as staff. I extended my hand as a sign of respect. It was refused, not because of the deal, not because of the numbers, but because of who I am." Her words cut cleanly, each syllable sharpened by years of restraint, each sentence carrying the weight of every insult she had swallowed in silence before this moment. "I want to be very clear. The partnership is off the table. Effective immediately. We will not move forward with any corporation that cannot recognize the basic humanity of those it claims to do business with." The reporters erupted, shouting questions, their cameras flashing like lightning. Naomi held up her hand, silencing the room once more. "This is not just about me. This is about every professional who has been underestimated, dismissed, or humiliated because of the color of their skin. This is about every woman who has had to work twice as hard to prove she belongs in the room. And this is about accountability. Respect is the foundation of business. Without it, there is nothing worth signing." The statement lasted less than 10 minutes, but by the time she stepped away from the podium, the world was already reacting. Headlines flooded the internet within seconds. $7.6 billion deal collapses over racist snub. CEO's handshake refusal sparks corporate firestorm. Naomi Carter walks away and takes the future with her. Social media exploded with clips of her speech. Some hailed her courage, calling her a trailblazer. Others debated the cost, wondering why she would let go of billions over a gesture. But Naomi knew better than anyone. It was never just about a handshake. It was about power, respect, and the dangerous precedent of letting racism pass without consequence. Back at his headquarters, the billionaire CEO was livid. He paced his office, shouting into his phone, demanding to know how the situation had spiraled so quickly. To him, the insult was small, insignificant. But now it was front-page news. Now shareholders were calling, demanding answers. Now the empire he had boasted about was trembling. Naomi, meanwhile, returned home in quiet composure. She didn't gloat. She didn't celebrate. She simply poured herself a glass of water, sat by her window overlooking the city, and exhaled. The weight of years, the sting of silence, the burden of always having to prove herself. Tonight, she had turned all of it into something undeniable. Her message was simple, and the world had heard it. Respect is priceless. The morning after Naomi's press conference, the city awoke to headlines that no one could ignore. Newspapers screamed from every corner stand, handshake refusal crashes $7.6 billion deal. Naomi Carter walks out, market staggers. On television, analysts debated furiously, their voices layered with disbelief. This wasn't just a deal, one commentator said. This was supposed to reshape the global aviation market. And now it's gone, because of arrogance. By noon, the billionaire CEO's empire was bleeding. Shares dropped more than 20% within hours, wiping out billions in market value. Traders flooded phone lines, investors demanded answers, and board members scrambled to contain the collapse. Behind closed doors, panic spread. The CEO had promised his directors a new era of growth, hinging entirely on Naomi's firm. Now, those promises were ashes. Shareholders, many of whom had already been uneasy about his leadership style, were enraged. Some called for emergency meetings, others drafted statements distancing themselves from his comments. Even longtime allies, men who had stood by him for decades, began to falter under the weight of the storm. Naomi's decision hadn't just ended one deal. It had exposed an uncomfortable truth, that racism wasn't just morally indefensible, it was financially reckless, and the world was watching. Social media amplified every second of the fallout. Clips of the refused handshake played on loop, paired with Naomi's declaration at the podium, "Respect is not optional." Hashtags trended worldwide. Black professionals shared their own stories of humiliation in offices, boardrooms, and interviews. Women of color in leadership positions wrote messages of solidarity. Naomi spoke for us all. Even ordinary viewers who had never stepped into a boardroom saw the lesson clearly. The narrative was no longer confined to business insiders. It was everywhere, on talk shows, late-night comedy monologues, podcasts dissecting power and race in America. Everywhere except in the CEO's office, where denial reigned. He stormed into meetings, insisting Naomi was overreacting, that it was a misunderstanding. But his excuses rang hollow. Video of his words was circulating, replayed endlessly. "I don't shake hands with staff." It was clear, it was undeniable, and it was indefensible. For once, his charm could not erase what the world had seen. Other corporations quickly began severing ties. A tech company paused a pending contract, citing concerns over leadership values. A European partner quietly withdrew from a joint venture. Even advertisers who had once coveted his brand began pulling campaigns, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. Inside his company, the tension was no less brutal. Employees whispered in hallways, morale sinking by the hour. Minority staff members felt the weight of the headlines personally, many questioning whether their years of silence had been complicit in enabling the very arrogance now destroying the empire. And at the center of it all was Naomi Carter, unshaken, unmoved, and utterly in control. She didn't need to shout. She didn't need to demand. All she had done was refuse to tolerate humiliation, and the world had responded. Financial reporters marveled at her restraint. "It takes a particular kind of strength," one anchor said, "to walk away from $7.6 billion. But what Naomi Carter proved is that dignity has a price tag far higher than money. Meanwhile, behind the glass walls of his crumbling empire, the CEO began to realize what his arrogance had cost. Not just money, not just reputation, but something far deeper. He had dismissed her humanity, and now the consequences were rewriting his legacy. For years, he had been the man whose name commanded fear, whose handshake was a seal of power. Now, he was the man remembered for the handshake he refused, the one that destroyed him. Naomi never saw her decision as the end of a deal. To her, it was the beginning of something larger. Walking away from $7.6 billion was not simply about punishing arrogance. It was about showing the world that racism carries consequences, not only moral but financial. And she wasn't going to stop at making an example of one man. Within days of the press conference, Naomi convened her board and announced the launch of a new initiative, the Equity in Business Foundation. Its mission was clear: to provide funding, mentorship, and resources to Black entrepreneurs, women in leadership, and marginalized professionals who had been locked out of opportunities for far too long. She pledged $500 million of her own firm's assets to kickstart the project, a bold move that sent ripples across the financial world. "If dignity is priceless," she told her team, "then investment in equity is not charity. It's the smartest investment we can make." The announcement reignited the media firestorm. Headlines now shifted from the collapse of the deal to Naomi's bold new vision. Naomi Carter turns billion-dollar snub into national movement. Equity in business, from humiliation to hope. Interviews poured in. She appeared on major networks, her calm voice recounting not just the handshake but the pattern behind it. "It wasn't about me alone," she told one anchor. It was about the thousands of professionals who walk into rooms every day, only to be seen as less than they are. This time, I had the power to respond, and I did. Her words struck deep. Emails began flooding her office from women and men across the country. A black attorney in Chicago wrote, "I've been mistaken for the paralegal in my own courtroom. Thank you for standing up." A Latina executive in Texas shared, "They call me the assistant at client dinners. Your story reminded me not to shrink." Naomi read each one, reminding herself why she couldn't let this end with a canceled contract. She was carrying more than her own dignity now. She was carrying theirs too. Meanwhile, the foundation began its first round of grants. Young entrepreneurs from Detroit, Atlanta, and Baltimore received funding that would have otherwise been denied by banks. Women in finance received mentorship opportunities that gave them access to networks they had long been excluded from. For them, Naomi wasn't just a symbol. She was a lifeline. Her opponents tried to frame it as theatrics. She walked away from billions to make a point. One critic scoffed. But Naomi didn't flinch. She understood that change was never comfortable, especially when it threatened those who had benefited from inequality. What mattered was the shift she had sparked. She had shown the business world that racism had a measurable cost, that underestimating black leadership was no longer just offensive. It was financially devastating. And with every interview, every speech, and every grant distributed, Naomi Carter made it clear. She wasn't waiting for others to change the system. She was building a new one. Naomi's decision reverberated far beyond one man, one company, or even one deal. What unfolded in that boardroom was not an isolated insult. It was a mirror reflecting the broader reality of how racism persists in spaces that pride themselves on being merit-based and inclusive. For every Naomi Carter who commands billions in assets, there are thousands of professionals who walk into offices and conference rooms each day only to be misjudged, mislabeled, and dismissed before they speak a single word. Studies have shown that black women are among the least represented in executive leadership across corporate America. They earn less than their white counterparts, face slower promotion rates, and are more likely to have their authority questioned in meetings. And the microaggressions, those daily, sharp cuts of doubt, often weigh just as heavily as outright discrimination. Naomi's humiliation in that boardroom wasn't new. It was a louder version of the same pattern professionals of color had endured quietly for decades. How many times has a black executive been mistaken for an assistant? How many times has a woman been ignored, only to have her idea praised when repeated by a man? How many deals have been signed in rooms where respect was absent, but silence prevailed? Naomi's silence that day had been mistaken for compliance, but her refusal to sign made the world ask a different question. What if silence isn't compliance? What if silence is a strategy? Her story became a lens through which millions saw their own experiences. It wasn't just about money, it was about identity, about the right to be seen and acknowledged for who you are, not reduced to what others assume you are. And perhaps most importantly, Naomi's stand exposed the cost of racism in terms that corporations could no longer ignore. It wasn't just a matter of ethics or morality, though it should have been. It was a matter of billions. Dignity, when violated, had the power to topple empires. The irony was sharp. For years, the CEO had positioned himself as a symbol of dominance, a man whose handshake sealed the future. Yet the very refusal of a handshake, his arrogance, became the undoing of everything he claimed to stand for. Naomi's response forced a reckoning. Conversations shifted in boardrooms across the country. Some companies, fearing the same backlash, accelerated diversity efforts. Others issued public statements affirming their commitment to inclusion, though many of those statements rang hollow. But whether genuine or performative, the message was clear. Ignoring racism had consequences, not only socially but financially. For Naomi, the bigger picture was not about punishment. It was about change. She often said in interviews, "I don't want to be the exception. I want to be the beginning." And in many ways she was. Her stand gave courage to those who had been waiting for a sign that resistance was possible. That saying no to humiliation was not career-ending, but transformative. Naomi Carter's story was no longer just a business headline. It had become a cultural marker. a reminder that racism, when confronted with dignity and power, could be forced to pay a price too steep to ignore. The press conference might have ended in minutes, but its echo reached further than Naomi could have imagined. For every headline about market losses and shareholder panic, there were thousands of quiet voices rising in gratitude, voices that had long been silenced or ignored. The emails came first. Her office inbox overflowed within hours, not with business inquiries, but with stories, real stories, raw stories. A Black attorney from Chicago wrote, "In court last week, I was asked if I was the paralegal. I have been practicing law for 10 years. When I saw your press conference, I cried. For once, I felt like someone said no for all of us." A young engineer from Atlanta sent a message. "I'm the only Black woman on my team. They always assume I'm in HR. Watching you walk away gave me the courage to stop apologizing for being here." From Houston came the words of a Latina executive. "They call me the assistant at client dinners. Your stand reminded me that silence isn't the only option." Each note told the same story in a different voice: humiliation, dismissal, resilience. And each one pointed back to the same truth. Naomi's stand had given them language for something they had carried alone for too long. Social media amplified it further. The clip of her saying, "Respect is not optional," was viewed millions of times within days. Hashtags spread across platforms, turning into a digital chorus of solidarity. Professionals of color began sharing their own handshake moments, the times they had been dismissed, ignored, or belittled in spaces where they had earned their place. One post read, "My boss introduces me as his secretary when clients visit. I'm his partner. Thank you, Naomi, for reminding me to stop shrinking." Another went viral with thousands of shares. Naomi Carter refused to sign for $7.6 billion. If she can do that, I can demand respect in my $60,000 job. It wasn't just about billion-dollar deals anymore. It was about everyday dignity. Even in classrooms, her story was being retold. A college student in Philadelphia wrote to her foundation, "Our professor used your press conference as an example in class. For the first time, I saw someone who looks like me being discussed not as a victim, but as the one holding the power." For Naomi, these responses mattered more than the headlines. This was why she had walked away. Not to punish a man, but to remind a generation that their worth could not be defined by someone else's arrogance. Her foundation, still in its early days, began spotlighting these stories on its website. They called it Echoes of Hope, a page where people could submit their experiences and read the testimonies of others. It became a digital community of resilience, a reminder that no one was alone in the struggle for recognition. Naomi often spent late nights scrolling through the stories herself, her heart heavy but also lifted. Each account was another reason she refused to regret her decision. Each story was proof that the price of dignity could never be measured in billions alone. The boardroom incident had started as one man's arrogance, but its aftermath had become a movement that belonged to everyone. And in the end, that was the true legacy of her decision. Not just a canceled deal, but a chorus of voices that could no longer be ignored. When the dust settled, what remained wasn't just the memory of a refused handshake. It was the lesson it carried. A billionaire thought he had drawn a line in the boardroom that day, a line separating who was worthy of respect and who wasn't. But in his arrogance, he failed to see that the line he drew was the one that divided the past from the future. On one side stood the old ways of power, arrogance, dismissal, racism dressed as authority. On the other stood Naomi Carter, unbent, unbroken, reminding the world that respect is not a favor but a right. The cost of his arrogance was staggering. Billions lost, partnerships dissolved, a legacy in ruins. But the value of Naomi's decision was immeasurable. She proved to every person watching that dignity is not something you trade, not even for $7.6 billion. And that is where the true weight of her story rests. Not in the collapse of a deal, but in the reminder that racism has consequences. Consequences that reach beyond hurt feelings into the very structures of power and money. Naomi's silence in that room was not a weakness. It was a strategy. Her walk to the podium was not anger. It was strength, and her refusal to compromise reminded us all that sometimes the most powerful word is no. So what about you? What would you have done if someone dismissed you so openly in front of your peers? Would you have stayed seated, signed your name, and let it slide? Or would you have walked away, knowing the cost, but protecting your dignity? And here's the harder question. Have you ever faced a moment where you were made to feel smaller because of your race, your gender, your background, and chose silence because speaking up felt impossible? Naomi's story doesn't erase that pain, but it does remind us that silence can be turned into strategy, that power can be reclaimed, and that respect can be demanded, even in the spaces designed to deny it. For those who have lived these moments, her story is proof that you are not alone. For those who have never experienced them, it is a challenge to look closely, to recognize the weight of words, the cost of arrogance, and the humanity too often dismissed. The world will forget the billions lost in this deal, but it will not forget the woman who walked away. Because she didn't just refuse a handshake, she refused to be erased. And in doing so, she wrote a story that belongs not only to her, but to everyone who has ever sat in silence, wondering if their worth was visible. Before you go, if this story moved you, make sure to subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the next one. And I want to hear from you. Drop in the comments the country you're watching from. Your voice matters here, and your story might be the one that gives someone else courage. Hate can humiliate. Racism can diminish. But dignity has the power to change the world. And Naomi Carter proved it.